Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm rich primary teachers. So this week we're joined by Liv Dempsey. Hi, Liv.
Hello.
Tom Oakley.
Hi, everybody.
And Charles Bankovitz.
Hi there.
And this week we're going to explore behaviour because it's been a topic of discussion in Discord, and I thought we'd address some of the questions that have been coming up. And obviously, Liv, head teacher, spent your first year really getting to grips with behavior. I don't know if that's the right phrase. It sounds quite angry, but getting a handle on trying not to come up with an angry metaphor. Exploring behavior in your school over the last 12 months. Tom, deputy head, put a lot of systems in place over the last couple of years, and then Charles teaching and obviously having to manage a class every day and with behavior top of your mind. And so I thought we'd begin with a little bit of context because behavior is often described as one of the biggest stressors for classroom teachers. And the fact that this gets mentioned and where people are requesting questions stuff is evidence of that. From your perspective, why does behavior remain such a challenge in primary schools, even when comprehensive policies are in place?
Personally, one of the reasons why behaviour is described as one of the biggest stresses is it genuinely is stressful. It genuinely does cause stress. It can be emotionally draining, and teachers can take unwanted behaviour, particularly persistent unwanted behaviour, quite personally, right? You know, it can feel like, what am I doing wrong? Where am I failing? Especially if you're a classroom teacher and you feel like, look, I'm following the policy, I'm doing what I say, but regardless of that, I'm still not finding it exactly where it is. So I think for lots of reasons, sometimes a policy alone isn't enough, and I know we'll go on to talk about policy and principles and those kind of things later, but unwanted behaviour can happen for so many reasons, and sometimes the most demoralising days are those where you've had a brilliant morning, right? The class have been eating out the palm of your hand, the lessons have gone really well, and then something or a series of somethings has happened at lunchtime, and it seems to have somehow then derailed the day. And you're like, well, how's that gone? And you find it really hard to remember the good morning. And that's what I'm like as a classroom teacher, you know, like, how was your day? And there'll be the one thing that comes to mind will be that time where either I felt like I lost grip of the lesson or behaviour didn't go where I wanted to. And I think when you teach a class or several classes day in, day out, it's exhausting, right? It's mentally exhausting, it's physically exhausting, it can be emotionally exhausting too. And I think the stress is real. And I think the more tired you get, the harder it can be to be consistent, to maintain those boundaries. And lots of teachers will have felt that towards the end of the summer term just gone, especially when the weather gets warm as well. You know, the children don't necessarily want to be there, they don't want to think really hard, and your job is to maintain that hard-working, hard-thinking, everyone's best effort. So I think one of the reasons why it's a challenge is because it is challenging, and the expectation on the teacher is to do a lot and to manage quite a lot all at the same time. And as the term goes on, it can be really hard to show up every day and be as consistent on day 190 of the school year as you were on day one. So from my point of view, I think it's stressful and challenging because it is the nature of maintaining a focused, well-attended, contented classroom is really hard to do, and it can be affected by so many different things. Classroom culture, pictured lessons, all of those kind of things can all buy into it, and some of those things just can't be touched by a policy.
I totally agree. I think also things that bring you stress are things that you don't have complete control over. And if you think about what we do within school, the math side of it, the English side of it, we predominantly as teachers have control over that. Whereas with behaviour, that we don't have a huge amount of control over. Yes, we have it control within our classroom, but the innate behaviour, the learned behaviour, is essentially the majority of it is down to parenting and down to the boundaries and norms and things that are put in place at home. And so whilst we may have a really effective policy in school, if the opposite of that is happening at home, or there's other things behind behaviours like trauma, ACEs, things like that, then we really don't have any control over it. And I think that adds a massive element of stress to it as well.
Yeah, 100% agree with what both of you are saying. I think as well, there's a lot happening in any classroom at any one time. You're trying to teach a lesson that you've planned, you might have resources out, you've got different extenuating circumstances within the same room, different needs coming, like you say, coming from at home, coming from all sorts of different places. And then you're on the door, you're ready to teach history after lunch. You open the door, and the first thing that one of the children says at the front of the line is, "There's been drama at lunchtime," and you think, "Oh, great." and there's just there can just be too much. It can feel like there's just too much to do at any one time. If you're trying to teach maybe 30 children, not just one, so you feel like, oh, I want to now give a bit of time to this, but I also want to go back to teaching the lesson, and it can all, especially like you say, when it gets a bit warm towards the end of the year, it can be a lot. And like Tom was touching on at the start, I think definitely as a teacher, you can feel like it's your fault over time. You don't necessarily, even though there's a policy, you know the policy, it sounds so simple on paper, you don't want to look like the teacher who's always making a fuss going to the office, or you don't want to basically look like you're not able to control the class, which I'm sure everyone who's ever taught in a school can empathise with on some level. Yes, there's so many reasons why the gap between what it says on the policy in a few paragraphs versus the kind of organic nature of what happens in the classroom. Another thing I was thinking about is how the time pressures that you have as a teacher and the conflicting priorities can make it difficult to follow the policy to the letter. For example, you might have had to give out a sanction or a consequence during the morning session, but then you realise, oh, I'm on break duty. So you say, oh, well, we'll maybe deal with this later at lunchtime. And then at lunchtime, something else happens, and then it's quite hard to be consistent in that way. But I would be interested to ask both you, Liv, and Tom, as SLT members, what do you say to this? Is that just the teacher's fault? They need to get their act together and sort themselves out a bit. And well, if you've given a consequence, you need to be aware of how you're going to follow that up. Or for example, the situation where, right, okay, we've got to level 4 on the policy. It's a behaviour 4 level situation. Well, I'm afraid, sorry, TA, please can you take such and such down to the office for a quick chat? Get to the office. Oh, they're on a meeting. Comes back, you're like, hooray, you're back. So it's easy for the teachers to say, well, it's SLT need to sort these things out. So how, I know I'm sort of asking two questions at the same time there, but is it just impossible to follow a policy to the letter of what it says on the page, or does there need to be room for flexibility there and understanding that SLT have tricky jobs just as much as a teacher does?
I think that's a really good question, and I think it's context specific sometimes. So you're right, you have a million things to do as a class teacher, and fitting them all in is a nightmare, and trying to remember everything is also a nightmare. I think if you've got a good relationship with your team, that goes a long way to help. So for example, if you were, in my school, if you were in that situation and you realised, oh, I'm on break duty, there's always going to be someone else who will help you out, whether they'll take their duty or they'll follow through that sanction. So I think having that team around you to help support is a really big thing, and that culture of helping each other out, which I know is not, always there in every school. From an SLT perspective, my setting is probably quite niche and very different. So we're in the top 20% of poverty and deprivation in the UK, but we're in the southeast and we're very close to leafy Surrey and lots of affluent places. When staff come to us as an SLT, it's normally because someone has been physically attacked and they need our help. And so we don't really ever have a meeting that we say we can't be disturbed in, because we know that if a staff member has come to us an SLT, it's because something really serious has happened and they genuinely need our support. So again, I think it's really context specific, but equally wasted is the wrong word. I've spent my entire morning dealing with one child who has bitten or kicked, or in one case at the end of term, beat another member of staff with a bamboo cane. And it's taken up my whole morning. And that's something, obviously, that morning I could have been doing something strategic, or I could have been doing something else to help move the school forward. But in that instance, I've had to spend my morning doing that. And I think that is something, again, that is really context specific. But I think the staff feel supported because I am there for them, and they know that I wouldn't ever put myself in a situation that I would would never put them in a situation that I'm not willing to be in. I hope that kind of answered your question. I felt like I was waffling. I'm really sorry.
Yeah, I can definitely see how if I was in your school and you've got that supportive culture, which I'm guessing we'll probably come on to in a little bit as well, the relationship between um, whole school consistency, individual decisions as well. So that's great. Thanks.
Did you want to add anything, Tom? Because I've got an opinion. I mean, although it has been a while since I've been in those kind of situations.
Keen to hear your opinion now, Kieran.
I mean, like, I think in terms of the context, Liv is talking about, if someone just can't be bothered, and I have seen this, I just can't be bothered with this child anymore, go to SLT. That's not appropriate use of SLT support. But where there are situations where, like you say, you follow the policy to the letter and you need to go to that next level, I think when we don't, as SLT, provide that support, we're letting teachers down. And so I think they have to know, in the same way the pupils have to know, that the consequences for their behavior are certain and are, they're, what's the phrase? It's the certainty of the consequence, not the severity of it. Teachers also need to know that when we are needed, because a lot of the schools I've worked in have been very similar to Liv's context. So yeah, that's where my take is that if SLT are truly supporting their teachers, there needs to be a guarantee that when it's demand, when there's a demand for their support, nothing else really matters, because safeguarding is number one priority. And I think behavior to that extreme certainly qualifies as safeguarding. I don't know if, hopefully that's not too controversial, but that's always been my sense as both a teacher and then whenever I was in senior leadership.
Yeah, and I don't think I've got too much to add or different to that. I completely agree. It's all about the certainty of the consequence, not the severity of the consequence. And I think wherever we can as SLT, we are always going to prioritise safeguarding over everything else. And even if it's persistent low-level behaviour, and it's not to the extent that, in the context that Kieran, you've worked in, that Liv, you work in, that I work in now, even if it's not the extent that somebody's being hit, beaten, bitten, or whatever, but it's just one child who is determined to derail this lesson, whether it be calling out, getting out, whatever it is, there needs to be that certainty that if we get to, Charles, your phrase, if we get to stage 4 or whatever it is, this will be that consequence. Now, that consequence probably shouldn't be as explicit as you will spend 5 minutes of your break time with person X. Yeah, it could be that they're going to spend 5 minutes of their break time with an adult. And that's where you want to have that culture come into play, where, okay, it might not be you today, but it'll be with so-and-so instead. And, in our school, we have a system where if teachers need us, even if it's just for an adult swap or that kind of stuff, then we have a radio where they can do so. But again, that's outlined in the policy that happens at this stage. But yeah, SLT will always prioritise safeguarding over pretty much everything else, unless it's some major incident where everybody's dealing with a fire. Yes, we will delegate somebody to that first, but 99.9 times out of 100, we are going to be there for that, and that's what we want to do.
It's already pretty clear that you guys are going to cut through a lot of the noise that surrounds behavior, because my sense online and with most things that there is a lot of noise. But some people argue that sanctions, rewards, and consequences stand in opposition to relationship building and quote unquote trauma-informed practice. Now, do you guys see these approaches as incompatible, or can they coexist effectively in a primary setting?
I am a big, big advocate of trauma-informed practice. And I think that some staff feel that it's the new thing that we're latching onto, and that we're going to go around, with flowers in our hair and say that it's all okay, and, and that there can't be sanctions and there can't be rewards, etc., etc. I think that they have to work hand in hand, and I think you have to understand where the behaviour is coming from and make sure that your sanction or reward system works in conjunction with that. Again, it needs to be context specific, and I think in some cases it needs to be individual child specific. What we're really conscious of, when I started in my setting, there wasn't really much of a behaviour policy, and we sort of almost had to start from scratch, and we are nowhere near where we want to be, but we've come on leaps and bounds. What we have tried to make sure is that we have a global policy which includes sanctions and rewards, but it also has allowances. So for some children, there will be a sanction, but it might not be quite the same sanction as somebody else because of the reason why that behaviour has happened. We also didn't want it to be where, the old adage where the naughty kids get all the good stuff, they get all the rewards, or they get whatever just because they sat still, they're allowed to have 10 minutes extra playtime. We wanted to make sure that didn't happen as well. So we introduced things like those children that just always behave and don't put a toe out of line, they go in a draw to go to the park. We're really lucky we have a park next door, and so for Friday afternoon break time there'll be a handful of kids that come across the park just because they've just done what we've asked them to do. And I just think that you need to make sure that those things go hand in hand, that yes, you are trauma informed and you understand where that behaviour is coming from, but within life there are sanctions and rewards and there are consequences to actions, and we need to prepare the children for that.
Unexpected consequences, unexpected sanctions can be counter to building positive relationships with children. If a sanction or a consequence comes out of nowhere, the child doesn't know that that's a consequence for that action, and you're going to enforce it anyway out of the blue, then I think that is going to be a deteriorating factor in building that relationship with that child. And particularly when you're working with children who have experienced or are experiencing ongoing trauma, if you cannot provide psychological safety for that child, if you bring added uncertainty into their day, it's going to be really hard for you as an adult to build a positive relationship with that child. And I think that's where, when schools are as transparent as possible with families and with new joining children, these are our expectations and these are how we teach our children our expectations, and this is what we do as a school. The more upfront you can be about that, that can be a real positive to help build relationships. This is who we are as a school. This is the approach that we take. I've said to parents before when giving them a tour of our school, if you are looking for us to be okay with the idea that it was okay for your child to retaliate because they were hit first, we aren't that school. We're not that school. We aren't going to go, yeah, it's fine. It's fine for you to punch him back. Now, that might be okay at home. You might be fine with that. And you might even encourage your children to do that. If he punches you, you punch him back. But we aren't that school. Okay? So I'm being really upfront about it. There will be occasions in our school where children don't behave the way we want them to. However, our expectation is children won't retaliate. And if they do retaliate, there'll be consequences for that retaliation. Now, if this doesn't sound like the school for you, then at least I've not sprung this on you later. Yeah. So these are the things that we expect. And it all starts from that first visit to the school, first meeting with the teacher. This is what we do. This is what we're looking for. This is how we demonstrate it. And when we do these things, these are the treats, rewards, etc., that we will get to. But yeah, I think my key point is if a sanction or a consequence comes out of the blue, then it is likely to deteriorate or prevent any relationship building. Whereas the more psychological safety, the more predictability you can bring to those children's routines, the easier it is to build positive relationships.
I suppose that's part of the problem, isn't it? That there's a perception, at least in my experience, that you've got two extremes. On one side, you've got shouting, screaming, names on the whiteboard, right? You're all missing half an hour of your break time. To the other extreme where you've got no consequences, like you were saying, Liv, we just sort of waltz around saying, oh dear, we'll have a restorative conversation, but it doesn't really matter. But so if like we're saying, that's a ridiculous false dichotomy, how do you bring staff, myself included, how do you bring us along onto that understanding of we still have consequences, or is it just something you build up, like as with anything in culture, you just build it up over time and you're explicit about it, you keep reminding. Yeah, how do you create that as a culture?
I think the one thing I would say, Charles, if you were joining our staff at our school, and I'm being very transparent, behaviour here is an everyday challenge. The key thing to remember is you're a teacher, right? So if that child has done something unwanted, in the same way if they've done something unwanted in their maths work, you're going to find the right moment to give that child feedback, and you're going to teach them how to do that question better next time. And then ultimately our culture for our school is we are teachers, right? We are not the kind of 1970s playground police. We are not there to detain the children and those kind of things. However, if it means that we need to take them somewhere so they can calm down and be safe and then teach them, that's what we'll do. right? So we're going to avoid that kind of getting in children's faces and screaming at them and all of those kind of stuff. Our main job is to teach. So we are going to help that child, particularly if they've been really dysregulated, we're going to help that child to get to a place of calm, to a place where they're ready to talk about how they were thinking, feeling at the time. And then from that point of view, then we're going to teach them. Yeah, and it might be that restorative conversation, those kind of things, comes later. But once that restorative conversation's happened, then we can do the consequential sanction after that. But until we've had a conversation about why this is unwanted and what our wanted actions would have been, and I think that's the way I talk about it with staff, is that ultimately our number one responsibility is to keep these children safe and to teach them to make better decisions next time. You know, ultimately, the best feedback you can get, whether it be professional feedback, written feedback, work feedback, or whatever, is that so children or the responder thinks differently next time. And that's ultimately what we want to do. So yeah, our job is to teach that child when they're in the position to receive that lesson. So I think that's where you bridge the gap between the two. Yes, we want to bring an end to that incident, etc. But if that child isn't ready to receive that lesson yet, that isn't the time to spring the consequence upon them. And I think that's where I find the middle ground between those two.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks. That's really, really well explained. Really, really clear. It's a bit of a commute for me to your school, so I'm sure you've got a good team as it is. But yeah, that's what you need, isn't it, as a teacher, as a staff member?
I just want to add one thing to that, Tom. Totally agree with everything that you said. The only extra thing I would say is that we've done some work with staff for them to understand why we need to wait for that conversation to happen. And we've looked at like fight, freeze responses in the brain and how the children can go into reptilian brain mode and really trying to understand why those emotions need to be regulated before you can have that conversation. Because we don't want staff to feel like we're fobbing them off.
My first year of teaching, behaviour was wild in my class. I was really bad at behaviour management. My head teacher would literally sit me down after something had happened and say, all right, let's reflect on what happened. Here are some of the possible reasons why this may have not. And I wasn't consistent. I was all of a sudden, right, you're never going outside again. You know, and that kind of thing. And so almost like you would feel like you would coach someone through anything. But it's almost like, you know, after you've had that cup of tea at the end of the day and you've calmed down a bit, like Tom said, you know, afternoons, you know, straight away at 3 o'clock's not the best time, but maybe 4 o'clock ish coming into the room, you know, how was it today? You know, and what can we do to make tomorrow better? And then bit by bit, you get better at it. And one, you know, for me, it was realizing that having a good relationship wasn't being their friend, but it was being the person who made them safe in school because they weren't necessarily safe at home, you know? And I think I learned the hard way. I would hope that other people wouldn't have to learn the hard way, but sometimes that kind of really visceral experience can sort of make you want to get better. You know, so, you know, through my mistakes, getting really clear feedback from senior leaders about, you know, here are the reasons this may not have gone as well as you'd hoped it to then, and here are the things that we'd like you to do. So, but again, that comes back to that supportive sort of culture that Tom and Liv have described, and that we think all teachers should have. I put air quotes on trauma informed because it's, you know, when you talk about Liv, you're talking about very specific instances and you're using it accurately, but it's like dysregulation. All of a sudden, every child is dysregulated when that's not really the case. There's a very specific case in which, you know, this is something that we need to support children with, and I think trauma informed, you know, maybe it's just LinkedIn, but it seems to be getting used to describe all manners of behaviors, you know. And when we come to the next one, you know, the phrase all behaviors communication. Now, the person who asked me to ask this question says recently becoming popular, but when I started teaching, this is one of the first things I was told was that all behavior was communication. That wasn't yesterday. How do you guys interpret this philosophy? And do you think it helps or hinders teachers when managing behavior?
Oh, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Behavior is communication, and again, you know, context specific. 99% of our behaviors in our setting are the children trying to communicate something across. We've got one child who we know is about to make disclosure because of the way that they're behaving, and that's how the process happens. And we know when another child's mum is going to have another baby because a series of behaviors, you know, happen. But I think it is a dangerous statement in some cases. You know, we do have some children who their behaviour is copying other children because of the attention that those children possibly get. And I think we just have to have that caution in the back of your mind when you're saying that they are communicating something to you. Yes, they are, but what exactly is it that they're communicating? Is it that actually they're seeking attention and not for the right reasons, or is it because they're seeking attention because actually we do need to give them some attention?
When thinking about a series of recent behaviours, it can be useful to think about it from the lens of communication. Can we learn something about what that child is going through at the moment through the actions they've recently taken or the behaviours they've recently shown, right? I think in the moment, it can be really hard to go, well, hold on a second, this child might be trying to tell me something. Because on not all occasions is that child thinking, I feel this way and I want to tell my teacher by acting out like this. Yeah, the children aren't going through that kind of logical process. I'm really tired, I'm really hungry, so if I throw pencils, my teacher will telepathically know I'm tired and hungry. I'm not doing this to tell that message. And often, particularly when it's a case of impulse control, a child has done something because they just go, I'll do that. They haven't gone through a series of self-talk, right? I'd really like Miss Dempsey to know I'm thinking this way. So if I stack those chairs, hide behind them, create a barricade and do this, she will immediately know I feel like this. They might have literally just done that because they thought like doing it at the time. But actually, when you stack that up with other recent events, you might go, we might need to have a longer conversation with this child or their family about whether something's going on because the behaviours they're demonstrating now are unusual for that child, or they're very similar to the behaviours they demonstrated 6 months ago when this other thing was going on in their life. So I think the phrase or behaviours communication isn't necessarily a helpful thing in the moment when you're like, okay, right, they've done this and I need to keep those children safe, but it can be a particularly helpful thing when reviewing either an incident or series of incidents as a kind of I hate to use the phrase after action report, that kind of what happened, why did it happen, what led to it, and those kind of things. And sometimes it can be useful for teachers and teaching assistants to remember that if you are having a one-to-one with a child, they've calmed down, they're in a position to talk, it can be useful to go through a series of checklists, particularly with younger children. Are you tired? Are you hungry? Do you need to go to the toilet? They're kind of personal needs, check in first. And then if any of those are a yes, let's just deal with that one first before we then talk about the behaviour, because until we've dealt with that, we're not going to get anywhere. Yeah, and again, hard and fast rules, policies, principles, that kind of stuff. Some teachers will say to me, I will not let a child go to the toilet during the input of a lesson. Hard and fast rule. Whereas I would say, if that child is absolutely bursting and all they can think about sat on that carpet is, I'm going to wet myself, I'm going to wet myself, I'm going to wet myself, I'm going to go wet myself, a phrase I didn't think I was going to use in the podcast today, then they're not listening to your input anyway, right? So sometimes we have to remind ourselves of that phrase. That child might not be trying to tell us something, but actually there's something else on their mind that's making them behave this way. They might not necessarily be trying to tell you telepathically, I feel this way, but I need to meet this need first, and then I can attend to the lesson, or then I can follow the instruction to line up, or whatever it may be. So yes, I think it's a useful phrase for thinking about when reflecting on behaviour afterwards. But in the moment, sometimes we might just need to help a child meet a need or do something more A to B before we try and get to the lesson or whatever it may be.
Yeah, would you say then it's because I've struggled with this phrase before because I think it can just be slapped on as a one size fits all. Well, all behaviour is communication, so deal with it, teachers. And again, I don't want to misrepresent it in any way, but is it more helpful than when you're thinking about more serious incidents of behaviour? If I could maybe do a little example, let's say you've got a class rule that maybe the pupils are sitting in rows, they're not supposed to turn around and talk to the children behind them and have a chat. So maybe you're in a lesson, some independent writing, you've got a few children turning around having a chat. Is it maybe a bit of an is it over egging it to say, well, all behaviour is communication, so they must be trying to tell you that they're bored or the work's too easy or too difficult, or you should just change your input or do something completely different? Because what you two are saying sounds really helpful for some of the more significant incidents that might happen, and really, really, you have to act, you have to do something, you have to respond to this in quite a decisive way. There's some distress involved. But if it's the, I suppose when I'm thinking about it in the as a teacher, am I basically, it's my fault. All behaviour is communication, so it's my fault. You should be more interesting. You should have planned a lesson on bottle flipping instead of adding and multiplying fractions, etc., etc. Yeah, if does that make sense?
Yes, that completely makes sense. And no, you shouldn't plan a lesson on bottle flipping instead of adding and multiplying. Yes, I think you make a really good point, right? Sometimes those children will just turn around and chat to their friends because they just want to turn around and chat to their friends, right? They're not necessarily going through anything major at that moment. It's just that's the thing they want to do. I think that becomes an issue to resolve if that child's doing it every time we're writing. You know, if that minor incident actually happens every single writing lesson or every single writing task, we might be able to infer that child has strong feelings about writing, or that writing is much further down in their list of preferences than talking to their mate behind them. And in that case, the child might not be doing it to communicate something to you, but they might be doing it as work avoidance. And they're communicating something to themselves. I would rather be doing this than that. So no, I don't think you're making a totally invalid point at all, Charles. I think it's a really, really important point to make, is that I think the phrase is useful especially when reviewing a big action, but it's also particularly useful if that child is doing that, air quotes, minor action several times. There's a pattern to it, and then actually that's something worth reviewing.
I mean, I think those two questions feed into each other. It's the interpretation and how it gets applied, and the distinction between the interpretation of people who are in the classroom, people who are in schools, and perhaps those who are not, and perhaps prescribing how teachers should behave from a distance. I don't know. Maybe that's an unfair characterization, but that's certainly how it appeals to me. Books like Running the Room, and I'm a big fan of Tom Bennett's work, is DFE guidance from quite a while ago now. I feel so old in this podcast, talking about things that happened a long time ago. Books like Running the Room, really influential in terms of behaviour discourse. But some primary colleagues have suggested that maybe there's a bit of separation between the strategies and the day-to-day realities of sort of classrooms with younger pupils in them. How applicable do you think these kind of approaches are in primary, and where might they need adapting?
I think, like you say, with younger children, so we're nursery and infants, and it has to be adapted. I think that the structure that the advice given, by Tom Bennett is spot on. Like we've already touched upon, knowing the certainty of the consequence is really, really important. Like Tom said about having that psychological safety, that there is going to be a consequence for behaviour. I think all of those things are really, really valid points. But when it comes to really, really little children, we have 2-year-olds who we're trying to put those first boundaries in place for, then you need to have a little bit of a tweak about it. And really, I think looking at the root cause again of behaviour isn't probably something that's on priority with Running the Room, for example. And that's something that we need to incorporate in. So yes, love the structure, but needs to be adapted down, especially for younger children.
It's been a long time since I read Running the Room, but I think one of my main memories of reading it is it struck lots of chords with teaching up at Key Stage 2. At no stage at that time in my career had I thought about teaching early years. I hadn't done that, at that time, and I wasn't reading it through that lens. Since then, I've spoken to and heard, I've heard different people talk about it. Heard Paul Dix talk about it. Heard Tom Bennett talk about behaviour. Actually, they've got so many things in common. People think about those books as being complete other ends of the scale, but actually, they're both talking about consistency. They're both talking about predictability. They're both talking about making the classroom a safe place, a place where children feel actively ready to be, to just exist, to learn, and all of those kind of things. Now, how we create the culture of safety, psychological safety, and readiness to learn is naturally going to look different in a preschool class to what it's going to look like in an A-level class. And I don't think that either Paul Dix or Tom Bennett or whoever is going to say that it should look exactly the same. But I think that there are so many common principles within those books about making sure that our expectations are clear. Yeah, we all want that. Nursery teachers want that. A-level teachers want that. Everyone in between wants that. the children know where they stand within terms of like decision making, how things get made. You have freedom in these areas, but these things, I hate the phrase non-negotiable, but we can't negotiate those things. These are the things that we must do to be safe. Now, the extent to what that looks like, again, is going to be really different. You know, in secondary schools, they might have really particular rules about where you sit, how you sit, and those kind of things. Now, they won't directly translate to a nursery carpet. Of course they won't. But there are going to be times when we have to be consistent, we have to be explicit in our expectations, and the number one thing is we want everyone to be calm, safe, and ready to learn. And I think particularly Twitter as it was, I mean, I haven't been on Twitter for a while, people would like to pick things as being the anti, you know, Tom Bennett is the anti-Paul Dixon, and actually they all want calm, safe, ready classrooms. They all want these things, and there's a lot to be gained from them. But I don't think anyone would. I mean, they might, but I don't think anyone's going to pick up those books and go, I must implement this word for word as it is in my classroom, regardless of age. I'd hate to think they would. And I'd like to think that over time, people will see there is a nuance in how you set up your classroom and how you set up your expectations to reflect the age and stage of the children that you teach. And I think that's my main take on it, really. You know, it's not a recipe, or that none of them are, you know, step-by-step instructions to follow, but the core principles about being calm, safe, ready to learn apply in lots of these books, and those things shouldn't be ignored.
It's that work you do early on that, you know, the child who understands what no means, you know, is a much happier and safer child as they go through the school. You know, in my nursery class, my reception class, I would have a beanbag, and the certainty was that should you be unsafe or should you be making the wrong choices, there was going to be an allotted amount of time on that beanbag, and even if that meant me sitting beside you. But over the year, you know, those 3-year-olds realized that when they had messed up, some of them would just take themselves off and sit down on the beanbag and turn over the timer, do their time, and then they're back out again. And if they get to year 1, year 2, and they understand that this is the same way school, this is the way school works, then I think you know, they feel safer. You know, obviously this is, you know, not taking into account of what's going on at home and stuff like that there. But I think, you know, it is those general principles apply. But I'm not going to sit a year 4 child on a beanbag. You know, what their consequence looks like is going to be much different, and that kind of thing. You know, so I'm totally with you guys.
Often we need scripts when things aren't going the way we want to, or we can see something becoming a persistent problem. But the vast majority of behaviours that the teacher deals with day in, day out aren't high-level behaviours, right? You know, the vast majority of behaviours that we are correcting are the unwanted, distracted behaviours, whether that be the calling out, the getting out of our place, and all of those kind of things, or the turning around, or those kind of things. And sometimes it can feel like actually the policy doesn't touch those things. And when the policy does mention those things, it's because it's happening all of the time. And where is that middle ground, right? Like every once in a while calls out just because of enthusiasm, you know, or that child who frequently gets up to sharpen their pencil in the lesson they don't like. And the reason why I don't think those books necessarily touch on that, or policies don't necessarily touch on that, is that they are unpredictable. The way you might deal with it would depend on whether you teach that child every day, or in secondary school you teach that child once in a fortnight. And I think ultimately the reason why secondary schools have to be a bit more down the line and everybody does it this way is because a group of children, a form class, might be taught by 12 different adults, and they need to ensure that they are going to hear exactly the same script day in, day out, lesson from lesson, regardless of who's teaching it. And I think in primary, you have a bit of a leeway to have a bit more of a personal touch with some of those children because you teach them so much more. And policy might not say actually how you deal with a Sean on a Wednesday afternoon when he's really looking forward to football club and he just can't sit still because he's full of excitement. And that might be a quiet word in the ear, or you have a table at the back of your classroom that's a concentration station, and I love anything that rhymes, concentration station, where he can go and just channel his energy for a minute. And policy might not quite touch that. But I think there are books out there, like Paul Dix's books, where it talks about how those relationships take time to build. You get to know the child, you get to know what makes them tick and those kind of things. And for primary school teachers, that is a little bit easier. And you won't see as much of that kind of softer, inverted commas, stuff in Running the Room or books by secondary school teachers, because they might never develop that same personal relationship as a primary school teacher might, who teaches a child for an entire year or longer. So I think that's my take on what you're talking about, the kind of the informal, the lower level, unpredictable behaviours that don't quite require you calling SLT.
Looking beyond systems and policies, what do you believe are the most effective ways to reduce the stress that poor behaviour places on teachers?
I think it's that culture and the relationship between staff. And, we were saying earlier about those low-level behaviours. Sometimes those low-level behaviours are the things that can tip people over the edge. And they need to know, and we've said about, yes, it is really important and safeguarding comes first, and that staff need to be able to come to SLT and be supported. But sometimes staff need to be able to come to you with, I just need a break because so-and-so has wittered all morning, and I'm at my end point, and if I don't have a break now, that's it, and having that culture where staff can do that or say that to one another and just to give themselves some space. Like you said, Charles, it's really, really stressful being a teacher. You've got so much to do and so much to pack in such a short amount of time. And you've got all of these external aggregators that you have absolutely no control over. And I think just having that relationship with your team at any level, so that staff know that you're there for them, that somebody is there for them, and that if they need that space and they need that support or advice, or they need to, at the end of the day, like you were saying, at 4 o'clock, look back over and say, okay, what did that behaviour mean? What could I have done there? Was my lesson really boring, and should I have been flipping a bottle? Be able to have those conversations and things. I think that's really, really important. And especially at an SLT level, when you're not in class the whole time. I know that some staff feel, well, you don't know what it's like because you're too far removed and you're outside it, and there's the value in getting into class and seeing these behaviours and being there for the staff, and they then in turn appreciate what you have to do with your day. I think that's really, really important.
If you feel like you can be honest about the situation, whether it's going quite well or if it's really difficult, and you feel like you're not going to be either scapegoated or blamed, not saying that's ever happened to me, but then you're going to feel like you're not facing it alone. You're going to feel like it's a manageable task. I'm sure it's the same. It's the same with anything, any kind of job, anything in life. So, I mean, it's the summer holidays now, so it's quite easy to talk about it, and it's quite a theoretical, detached way. But I don't know. I'm sure there are lots of teachers around the country who are starting to have those dreams that you get in the last couple of weeks of August of you're standing in front of the class and people are throwing paper around and cannonballs and you're screaming and no one's listening. Maybe that's just me. But if it were just to be me, a podcast that's publicly available would be not the best place to announce it. But anyway, it is the number one. I think it's got to be the number one thing that makes you a bit anxious before the start of a new year or worried about getting into work. So if you feel like you've got a team, and you're not doing it alone, it's going to make a whole world of difference. So basically exactly what you just said.
I mean, you're describing my RE class there in secondary school, because we used to have like the tables would get flipped and there'd be opposing sides of the room. And then there was like, we're on the second floor, so bags would go out the windows, pens, people get split on the eye with pens and things. You literally, as you said that, I was all like, oh my God, I've forgotten all about that. There's some unaddressed trauma.
Based on what you guys have said so far, I think the answer to the question, kind of what are the most effective ways to reduce the stress, I think the answer probably is culture, right? But we also have to bear in mind that some people listening to this might feel like they're working in a school where that culture doesn't exist. Right? That there's a potential that people are listening to this going, I wish I worked in Liv school. I wish I worked in Charles school, where you can go to your neighbour classroom teacher or your SLT and go, I'm really struggling with this. Especially when it's something that's deemed low level or minor. I'm really struggling with the tapping of pens on tables, right? That kind of, yes, that is an anxiety dream right there. Why have I not got control of this tapping of pens on tables? And I feel like I can't go to another professional and say, what's wrong with me, right? And I think there probably will be people listening that go, I haven't got someone to turn to. And my answer would be that it only takes one person to help change a culture, right? And that you can seek out other people and go, this is what I'm going through. Have you got anything like that? And particularly if you're aware that there are other classrooms in the school where behaviour isn't ideal, and talking to those teachers. But sometimes it takes one person to start that culture and go, I'm having a hard time with this. And if anybody else is feeling the same way, I'd love to hear about it. Because we all know those schools do exist, right? Where teachers only nod to each other in passing down the corridor and don't really call on each other. And I would love to think that those are bygone days. But, having been an advisor, I know that's not the case. I know there are those schools. And I would love to say that every school has great culture and we can check on each other. But if you are a teacher in that situation where you feel like your school doesn't have that culture, either try and find that bravery in you to start that conversation, even if it's with your teaching assistant or those kind of things, and try and start with just one other person. The other thing I would add to what's already been said is that when you're talking about the persistent behaviour of a child, it's always useful advice to remember that you are not the only important adult in that child's life, and that if you can, it's really important to try and build, even if it's just a professional dialogue with their parent or carer, to say, whilst your child is doing these positive things, at the moment, one of the things that's getting in the way of them learning is that they're doing this. And I really want your help with overcoming this problem. And where that's possible, I think that's a really useful thing to take. A really useful step to take is that starting that professional dialogue with their parent and saying, your child's doing this, this and this, but they could be doing even better if we could reduce the amount of that. If you can work with me on that, then both of us will see improvements in your child's learning and their behaviour, etc. So, yeah, I think the answer is culture, but we might need to recognise that some people are not in those situations, and they might not have that, and they either might need to reach out to somebody, or they might need to start close at home with a teaching assistant or year group partner or the member of SLT that they trust the most, and start there and see if they can engender that culture, see if they can be a change maker.
That's this episode's call to action, right? Be the change.
I mean, it's been the theme of the summer, really. I don't know if you guys have listened to Nick Gibbs' episode yet, but he was talking about how, no matter who's in government, teachers have got, the opportunity to take control or maintain control of the profession. The soon to be released SEND episodes with first with Peps and Jen and Chris and then Lloyd and Shannon. Very much a case of teachers taking control even when perhaps external forces seem to be conspiring against us, and it's, and even by Tom, when we last spoke, it's about not only senior leaders talking to each other about how they can enact this change in schools, but like Charles, you find in a WhatsApp group with a couple of teachers who are in the same position. You don't have to be experts, but you just someone to talk to, because like I mentioned, my first year was an absolute nightmare as far as behavior was concerned. But like I'm still really good friends with the people who I talk to every day about that after school. There were there were a couple of people I'm thinking of a year ahead of me. They'd been NQTs the previous year, and we debrief, and then we go to the pub on a Friday and then debrief the whole week and stuff. And so there were almost systems outside the systems. And it's about finding those. So I think you're right, Liv. That's the call to arms. The call to action is be there for each other, because every single teacher I've ever spoken to has wanted to help other teachers. So many people over almost 250 weeks volunteering their time for free just to help other people. So that's the profession we work in. So I think that's definitely the way to go. And as I'm thinking here, I'm going to try and drop this just before we go back to school, so that if there is anyone who's out there and they are having the dreads, well, maybe they've got a chance to listen to this, which I think fits really well with the last question. If you were advising a new teacher entering the profession today, what would be the one piece of wisdom you'd want them to carry about managing behaviour in a primary classroom?
Relationships would be my number one piece of advice. Tom just touched on parental relationships and working in tandem with parents, and building those relationships with the children. Like we said, being in the primary setting, we have got the luxury of spending a lot of time with the children, and therefore we can build those relationships. And with those relationships, you get to know the children really well. You get to know what might trigger things. You get to know what works. You get to know how to tweak the behaviour policy to make sure it fits your classroom, and then to have that support on the side from the parents and the relationship with your colleagues. I think probably the easiest way to help.
There's one line that during my teacher training, visiting speaker, I'm afraid I can't remember who they were, said, and that on a few occasions, not many, but on a few, it's been really helpful. And that's when you get into a situation where you have a bit of an impasse with the pupil, whether they're refusing to follow an instruction, you've given a warning, you've explained why. One line you can say is, "I just need to check, are you refusing to follow instructions from an adult?" And that seems a bit, ooh, you've a mic drop moment for the teacher, but it's not supposed to be. It's just to help them understand what kind of a situation they're in. And I don't know if it's not the most important thing to know going into the profession, but I think it's been quite helpful on a few occasions. Yeah, I just need to check, are you refusing to follow instructions from an adult? And then obviously following it up with all the things we've been talking about so far. Apart from that, probably bottle flipping Fridays. It's what the children really want to do, and we're just there to help them develop their own interests and help them to thrive.
Charles, you're showing your age there because bottle flipping has not been in for a long time. I'm pretty sure I was in the classroom whenever that was, it's Roblox now, and whether they're stealing those brain rot memes from each other, the tears we've had this summer because some animal has been stolen from someone's pen. That's where the cutting edge is, Charles. So do that on Fridays, Roblox Fridays.
Is RuneScape out now then? Is that finished still?
I don't know how to follow that. I've really struggled with this one. I found it really hard to think about what the one piece of advice would be. I flipped between trying as much as possible to be consistent, right? That's what the children expect of you. That's what they need of you. Be as consistent as you would. But I think that piece of advice might be a bit vanilla, and they might have heard it 100 times already, right? The other one I consider is that when you've had a tough day or a tough piece of feedback or a tough conversation with a child or a parent, to think about how you need to take that professionally and not personally, right? If this feedback is about your teaching or the action you took, wherever possible, try and get yourself into a space where you can think about that from the point of view of being a professional, right? And I think that's a really useful piece of advice for any new person to the profession. When you receive feedback or you're reflecting on your day, try and think about how to take that professionally and not personally. And again, as a piece of advice, it sounds like a really solid one, but it's hard to do because we're people, right? And most teachers would commonly say, "I am a teacher," right? That's who I am. It's not just what I do, but it's who I am. I'm a teacher. So it's hard to separate professional and personal. The other one, this is me, Kieran, doing a classic Chris Simpson giving 5 answers to one question, is that when you're thinking about behaviour and improving behaviour, just thinking about nudging norms, and I'm sure Peps McRae's got lots to say about nudging norms, and he's mentioned it lots of times in his evidence snacks. But the one I did settle on, and I must give an answer, is that don't forget to look for signs of progress. Right? Don't forget to look for signs of progress. It can be easy to get down on yourself and to think about the one thing that went wrong. But actually, if you are a parent of a child or, there's a significant child in your life, when you meet up with somebody who hasn't seen your child for a while, like, wow, haven't they changed? Haven't they grown? Haven't they done da-da-da-da? And it's the same for your class, right? There'll be things that your class does a week in, a term in, half a term in that you might not have noticed that they now do. So I would say my one piece of advice is don't forget to look for signs of progress because it's there. It just might not be the easiest thing to see. Very long answer to what should have been a short question, sorry.
Just wait till you see the version that goes out, Tom. It'll be like, I have nothing to add here.
Yeah, no comment.
But I think what you guys are saying is fantastic advice. And one thing that's really clear from this whole conversation is just how complex behavior is. And so one of the things we've talked about way at the start and all the way through this podcast has been the idea that as a new teacher, the most important thing to do is to try and get to grips with your behavior management strategies, but that won't happen in a short space of time. You should almost be mentally prepared for things not to be going very well early on this at the start of the academic year. But hopefully, the experienced teachers listening are thinking, okay, what can I do to support those teachers in that situation? Because if you're getting to October and you're looking for those signs of progress and you're analyzing those relationships, Liv, hopefully you're seeing that things are better than what they were on the 6th of September, wherever we go back, and if they're not, well, then we need to ask ourselves, is that because we're not being reflective, or is it because we're not being supported? And I'm sure there are other options, but typically they come down to those two. So my one piece, to round everything off, would be that if you're new, expect it to be difficult, but the payoff will be worth the effort in the end. And then you can fly as a teacher as a result. So, it's been fantastic talking to you guys. We could have gone on for many hours. Liv, you're actually on holiday and you need to go back and get the last hour or so of sunlight. And Tom and Charles, you need to enjoy what remains of the hot weather for today, because I think the weekend's going to get worse. So all that's left to do is say thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much, Liv.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles.
Thanks, been a pleasure.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.